Mike, welcome to the podcast. So excited to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Let's start out with career progression. You've talked about this topic quite a bit in prior interviews. Let's give some people some background on your own progression, working from accountant at big firms like EY and Protiviti, and then doing a master's in counterterrorism and working in that for a bit.
I guess you just let go of the punchline there, which is, I mean, I started as most people in the business realm do at business school. Went into a big accounting firm to get my chartered accountant designation, and so that was Ernst and Young. I was there as an external auditor. Moved over to Protiviti in consulting, which frankly was very similar to working at EY. Protiviti itself is really operates like a big four accounting firm in a lot of ways. It's really big in the US. And I was doing like internal control and process kind of consulting there. And I just decided that that really wasn't where I wanted to be. And it's not that they aren't both great firms. I mean, I say this about EY a lot. I didn't like being an auditor, but EY is a great company and taught me a whole lot about how to run a really great operation, but I was just in the wrong job. And so being the strange wanderer that I am, I decided to, do what every good chartered accountant does when they don't know what to do. And that's go back to school and get a master's degree in counterterrorism. And that
Love that.
came, sorry, go ahead.
No, I said love that.
Yeah, I mean that came completely out of interest. I'm a big history nerd. I'm a big politics junkie, and as a millennial, you grow up and hear follow your passion, which I actually have a problem with. And I think we're going to get there later in the discussion. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to go follow my passion. And I love these things. I love reading about them in my spare time. And I ended up finding this program based in Ottawa at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs that really just seemed to check a lot of boxes for me. And so I applied to that, and somehow they thought me as an accountant was a good fit for the program, and they let me in. And it was great. I mean, it was a phenomenal experience because it opened me up to a whole world that as a business school student, I'd never been exposed to. I mean, the academic world is really its own beast. And I learned enough to know that it probably wasn't the right fit for me, but it's a great space for a lot of different reasons. And it taught me a whole lot. I mean, especially when it comes to writing and that kind of communication that, again, as a business school student, it's not like I was writing 40-page essays all the time. I was writing case studies. So it was really great for that. And I ended up getting a job at Scotiabank in their security department, which most people often think I mean securities, but that's not what it was. It was actually about trying to develop plans for what happens if a dirty bomb goes off in downtown Toronto. How does Scotiabank respond to that kind of a crisis? Scotiabank also has a lot of presence in South America and South Asia. And so they deal with all sorts of things from like narco terrorism to everything that you can imagine under the sun in those kind of locales. And so it was, again, a really interesting job. But what was so distinct for me was I came out of it and I went, I actually liked accounting better. And what I mean by that is even though the subject matter was like thrilling to me, that's the stuff that I love. I was spending all day sitting behind a computer writing a report. And at least as an accountant, and this may shock people who aren't accountants in the audience, you actually spend a lot of time talking to people. Like, especially as an auditor, you're going to your clients and you're talking to them and trying to find out things about the company and learn why they did certain things and why they did it this way and that way. And all of that was much more social than this new job was. And so I came out of that summer a little bit disenfranchised with, geez, what the heck am I going to do with myself now? So I ended up finishing up my master's degree and completely randomly happening upon a startup company. A guy that I became friends with was starting a company, and he showed me his business plan just because, we were buddies, and it had a something on his one-page business plan said like CFO needed or something. I was like, well, maybe I can help out with this stuff. And so I just started helping out. I was doing it just on the side voluntarily for a couple of months as I was finishing my master's degree. And eventually he asked me to come join the company. And so that was how I got into the startup world.
Yeah, and this one other thing that I really connected with, and I think this is jumping into that a bit, is this concept of industry versus function. And as somebody who went to law school, absolutely loved law school, and then came out into the practice of law with billable hours and heavy, heavy paper, heavy paper focus in terms of actually just gathering documents and like physically bringing them to the courthouse, can totally empathize with that. Can you talk a little bit about that in particular? And because the same thing happened to me. I ended up going from practice and just jumping early stage startup, sixth employee, kind of taking on everything with a different function, and loved that.
Yeah, I think this actually takes us back to what we were talking about earlier about following your passion. I think you hear this a lot, and you might, like, let's say you're somebody that loves cars. You would go, oh, like, I want to go work at a car company. Well, it's like, well, do you want to work at anything at a car company? Do you want to be the janitor at GM? Do you want to be marketer at GM? Do you want to be the accountant at GM? Like, those are very different things. And so I like to focus on what I call function, because the reality is, if you get good at one thing, whether that's janitorial services or marketing or accounting or whatever it might be, if you get really good at that and you develop a reputation and a skill set in that area, you'll be able to apply that in whatever kind of company you want down the road. And so I look at it in that way, where it's like, if I really, really want to be a finance person at a car company, I need to figure out how to be a finance person first, and then how to get into a car company, not just get into a car company that won't allow me to actually build up the skills that I want to continue to do. And the function at the end of the day, the thing that you actually do every day, the day-to-day tasks that you accomplish, is so much more of your life than the industry really is, right? Whether, like, as an auditor, I was an auditor in the mining industry, in manufacturing, in education. I mean, I audited a ton of different kinds of companies. The job of auditing is reasonably the same throughout. Of course, there are little differences. Like, I don't mean to oversimplify that, but the reality was is that I was generating and learning a core set of skills that I could have applied in many different industries. And at that point, if I really wanted to continue being an auditor, I could have been an auditor or an accountant or some kind of finance person in a whole slew of industries. Whereas if I had decided that I actually wanted to be a marketer, I would be completely incapable of doing that job and of actually getting that job to begin with. Like, I wouldn't be able to actually get the job, let alone do it competently. And so that's why I say, I really, really suggest focusing on function. Learn what you do, get very good at the thing that you like to do, and then apply it to the industry that you're excited about. And I think the last thing to say on that is, like, you're spending 8, 10, 12, 14 hours a day, whatever it is, in what you're doing. If you don't like being an accountant, doing that at a company that you're really excited about, you're still being an accountant 12 hours a day, right? And so if you really want to be a marketer first, right? And you'll never be happy doing the thing that you love, or sorry, the thing that you don't love at a place that you love. But you actually can be happy doing a thing that you love at a company that you're not particularly excited about, which actually gets me to my own startup experience, which was I joined a tech startup that was focused on wearable technology for cyclists. The people that wear like lycra suits and they are really intense about cycling. They're a really interesting breed of people. I really enjoyed getting to know those people, but I am not one of those people. And that was fine because I loved my job at that company, even though I wasn't ever going to be a cyclist. That wasn't really my jam, but I still loved my job there.
Yeah, and that comes back to, I think there are some people who really just love particular fun, like entrepreneurial type people love kind of chaos, right? Like there are some
Yeah.
people who just love uncertainty and just really get their kicks from that. I do want to bring this back to a larger topic because I think you're really, and we'll get to Luminari and LumiQ in a second because it plays into this, but you're pretty uniquely positioned to talk about this, right? Like you are a former professional and you talk to quite a few accounting professionals, right? Like you talk to a lot of
Spend a
them,
lot of my life doing
spend a
that.
lot of
Yeah.
time talking to these people. And I wanted to bring up this topic because I've been to one of the big four accounting firms, and we did a large enterprise deal there. And I remember talking to the national head of tax, and they told us their turnover rate, I won't say what it was high, right? It was high
Yeah.
specifically
Yeah.
among young people. And there's this kind of growing tension between the new way of work and career progression in general, with young professionals then being dissatisfied at these big incumbents. Is it that people should just generally look at startups more, or do big companies, big accounting firms, big players like IBM, I have friends that work there and just like, no, I need to get into a smaller company. Do they need to change? Like, how do you see the future of work in this kind of way after talking to so many professionals?
There's a couple of ways that I could answer that. I mean, one of them for sure, just to mention, when it comes to the big four accounting firms specifically, is it's actually built into their model. They suck in, like, I think when I started at EY, there were like 110 of us that started at the same day right out of university. And frankly, if 90% of us don't leave, they're going to have too many people at the middle ranks, and then eventually the higher ranks, which I never got to by any stretch. But they can't have all 110 of us or whatever it was become partners, because they'd have too many of us. So there's an aspect of the model there that they're built for. And in that way, they're great training grounds. Like, certainly I have experienced, for anybody listening that's debating whether to go into that kind of an environment, as much as I did not like my job there, it was a fantastic tool for me to learn how to be a professional, how to present myself to a CFO of a company when I'm some scraggly little 21-year-old kid that doesn't know anything at all, and try to not make a fool of myself. It was phenomenal for all of that, and lots of other skills that I learned. Now, to answer your question more specifically about kind of how young people think about the workplace, I think there is an aspect of what you're saying where a lot of young people want to take on, to use a buzzword on this, more strategic roles. I'm air quoting for those listening that can't see. Take on more strategic roles earlier in their career. And startups are a great way to do that, because there aren't these layers of hierarchy above you that have done it before. But there is a little bit of a fallacy there as well, which is that a lot of times you're actually just not ready to take that stuff on. And those kinds of big companies are great places to make yourself ready for that. So there's that aspect of it. The other side of it, which I actually say this to every person that interviews for a job at my company, which is that really talented, capable, smart, amazing people sometimes just aren't a good fit for a startup. And that doesn't mean that they're not amazing at what they do. In fact, the other way around, or the opposite, is also true. Like, I would be terrible at a big company right now. Like, I would not fit in well. I wouldn't be the kind of employee that would succeed in that environment. And so I think it's much more personal. I don't think there's a right or wrong. It's very personal. You got to understand yourself, which took me a bunch of career hopping to really figure out, before I did. But like, I'm just better suited to an environment where there's less hierarchy, there's more chaos, to put it that way. A lot of people want to become very, very good at a narrow thing that they do. And we need that in society. That's how we get specialists that are very good at certain things. Other people want to take on a broader range of skills and be not as good at them. And those people are great for startups, right? Either you're a jack of all trades and master of none, or you're a master of something and not a jack of all trades, and both are important. So I guess I don't dichotomize it as good or bad. I just think about it as like, what makes sense for you.
I'm really glad to hear that nuanced view, because I've definitely seen, as somebody who's been on both sides myself as well, on the startup side, like, there's a lot of everybody should just work at a startup, right? Or everybody should just be building their
definitely
own.
Not.
But you did that, so let's talk a little bit about how that happened.
Sure.
So yeah, let's get some background on Luminari, how you met Adam, and all that good stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, Adam is my best friend. We've been really, really close friends for a long time, and the idea of starting a company with your friends is neither a good nor bad idea. Similar to what we were just talking about, like, some of my friends who I love very dearly, I would never start a company with. Other of my friends, I would, like Adam. For us, it works. And I think probably the best testing ground for us was we went on a lot of trips together. Like, we did a lot of traveling. We backpacked Europe together. We backpacked South America together. We did a lot of that kind of stuff. You really find out if you can deal with hard shit together when you're, two guys that are like 22 years old in a country where you don't speak their language and can't understand the maps that you have. And, your hotel gets canceled for whatever reason, and it's 9 o'clock at night and you've had 10 hours of travel and you're pissed off. And, if you can live through that scenario and do it laughing at each other and with each other and not, wanting to wring each other's necks, it's a really good way of determining whether you can be with that person in tough situations. And like with Adam and I, we spent something like, we did like a 2.5 month trip in Europe, and probably 2/3 of it was just us. Like we met up with friends along the way, but it was just us alone in like a random place in the world. And if you can spend that much time with somebody, and again, not want to kill them, then that's a pretty good sign. So we were really close friends. We had the idea of starting a business from my experience at the wearable tech startup that I mentioned. I was telling him about my experience there, and like we had a lot of really amazing, smart people at that company. We had some leadership issues. We had some commercialization issues around the technology. It was really cutting edge stuff that wasn't quite ready to really enter the market. So, I mean, as you might have suspected, that company did not end up succeeding. But it gave me the startup bug, and Adam, living vicariously through my experiences, he had always been an entrepreneur at heart. And hearing it all and everything, we just decided, okay, like we've got to go start a business together. And we didn't have, like a lot of great entrepreneurs have this story of, I had this insight about this idea or this problem that we wanted to solve, and then we went and solved it. And that's a really great idea, or a really great scenario to have. We did not have that. We were like, we want to start a business. We have no freaking idea what problem we want to solve. And we spent months thinking of ideas and trying to validate it with the people that we thought would be the target market for that particular idea. When we launched, quote unquote, our company, it was a completely different thing. We spent about 4 months, 100-hour weeks trying to validate this idea, and we couldn't. I mean, we came to the decision, probably we could have come to it 3 months in, but 4 months in, or maybe we could have done it even sooner. But regardless, 4 months in, we said, we're not going to do this. We can't go and build this product because we don't believe that it's going to succeed. And as two non-technical co-founders, we couldn't just go and spend 200 grand building something that we didn't think had legs. And so we didn't. And that was a really hard moment. I mean, we can talk about that later, but we ultimately ended up, through some of the insights that we had gained trying to validate that idea, it led into what the original version of Luminari was, which was actually a recruitment platform. And we did that for 2.5 years. And that had some legs, but still not enough. I mean, we validated the basic idea. We turned it into a business. We were making something like 750 grand a year on it, which seemed like it was going well, but it wasn't scaling fast enough. And it was our closeness with our market of CPAs that led us to the insight that turned into LumaQ, which now, in under 2 years of having this product in market, is already way more successful than our previous product. So it was all part of the journey.
Well, hang on, because this is pretty interesting, right? So you, like some folks, the leap, right? The leap into your own business is always a big one. When should I quit my job? It's such a typical question. And it's always this kind of leap of faith. Like, I just had to quit at some point. You just had to go. It sounds like you didn't do this side hustle for a bit and then decide to leave. You guys kind of fell in love with the idea of being an entrepreneur, and you just left, and then you just started this thing immediately. So I want to know what went into that decision, but also $750K a year is a good business, right? Like, why not just be happy with that? I mean, you guys can live on that. You're two guys, like $750K a year is great.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll tackle the first question first. So I was at this startup that, frankly, like, I saw the writing on the wall. It was not going to be successful. If I'm being really honest, I was working with a leader that taught me everything that I know about how to not be a CEO. And in that experience, like, I had finally had enough, and I didn't want to continue, even though, frankly, the rest of that team were amazing people. One of the co-founders is like one of my best friends now, and the head of software at that company is now the CTO at my company. So I made a lot of great friends there, and there were some fantastic people, but leadership was an issue, and I was ready to go. And so when I left that company, I left that company not necessarily to start a company, even though that was the plan. My co-founder Adam and I had been talking about it. So my decision was easier. It was Adam's that was a lot harder because he had a job at he was at an ad agency at the time. He's a marketer. He had a good job, and he decided to quit, which was not something that his family appreciated at the moment. But hopefully now they're okay with it. Um, and I mean, I can comment at least a little bit on his headspace, which was that we have felt, and I don't think that this is a rule, but it's how I continue to feel, that if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you've got to be all in. And being half in, like I've seen a lot of businesses that probably could have been good businesses, but failed because the people weren't all in. And somebody said it to me this way years ago, and I really do believe that it's true. Choosing to be a founder isn't a job choice, it's a lifestyle choice. And that comes with good and bad. Like I don't want to overly glamorize the life. In fact, I want to do the exact opposite because there's a lot of bad. But it is a lifestyle choice, good and bad, all encompassing. To answer your second question around why didn't we just continue with our business? It was making about $750,000 a year. And one was that we weren't, if you looked at the unit economics of our business, we were putting in much more effort for every dollar that we were taking out of it. Mm. And so much of the success of that business was premised on like the manual labor of Adam, myself, and the other people on our team at the time. And that was not sustainable, and it certainly wasn't scalable. The other piece of it really is that scalability part, that we didn't want to just build an okay business. We wanted to build like a big business that could become bigger. Now, I'll preface that with saying like, we don't have any delusions of grandeur. We don't need to be Mark Zuckerberg or like create the next Instagram or whatever. And, you know, I have a lot of misgivings about the fact that a lot of people see like VC as the only option. It is a good option in certain cases, but it's not the only option. But we wanted to build something bigger than what that was. And so that was what led us there. And I'd say the third component was just that we came across this problem that we thought was actually a much better problem to solve, which was continuing education requirements for designated professionals. It's an industry that is still very much stuck in kind of, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. People pay a lot of money for it. And I'd say one of the deepest aspects of it for me, and where the passion comes out for me, I finally got to mix function and industry on my side, was that like, I'm a nerd. I love learning. And a lot of times learning is terrible, not because learning is terrible, but because of the means of doing that learning. And there's like, our tagline for our company is enjoy CPD. CPD stands for continuing professional development, because it's such an oxymoron to people. They mostly view it as this like horrible compliance thing that they just have to do. It's a check mark that they have to, a checkbox that they have to check off by the end of the year to maintain their designation. And I thought that was silly. These are like, you know, really fantastic professionals whose time is very valuable, and they're spending 20 hours a year clicking through silly webinars that they weren't taking away anything from. And I said, well, hold on, we can make this entertaining and engaging, and you can actually build something in your career out of it. And so mixing those two things together was exciting for us. So long-winded answer to your question there, but a lot of different pieces came into it.
And I definitely want to talk about you guys pivoting, right? Because especially now, this podcast is for founders in Canada, and a lot of them are having to pivot during this time. Like either they had product market fit in 2019, or they had a whole sales process in 2019, outbound and MQL. So it just doesn't work now, right? It can be a huge disaster. All their numbers are off. You guys had to go through this process. It was before this, but you've gone through it. Originally this job board, and I can picture it now, right? So I get it. It's a services heavy business. You got to hire a bunch of people. It's like hundreds of hours. Yeah, you're making great top line, but at the end of the day, you're going to kill yourselves doing it. So you want to create the software business. You guys participate in Creative Destruction Lab, and you work with some coaches who say like, look, you guys have this lifestyle business. You recognize this too. How did you go through that process of pivoting? And what would be your advice? Maybe after, what would be your advice to people that are definitely going through that right now? Because a lot of people are.
Yeah, I mean, we pivoted a lot, not because of COVID, but as you mentioned, but we pivoted many, many times throughout this process. And I mean, my number one advice is like, don't fall in love with your ideas, because I mean, ideas aren't worth very much. I mean, we were very naive about that early on too. Like, we didn't want to tell people what we were doing because somebody was going to steal our brilliant idea. It's like, no, that's probably not the case. And execution is really what matters at the end of the day. I guess that's the number one piece of advice, is just don't fall in love with it. Be your own business's biggest skeptic, so that you can see more clearly the problems that you face. And I think that was what it was with the first business that we tried to launch. And we really just, like, I think other people may have continued forward and built it anyways because of a belief in it. And it's not that that always fails. I mean, there's lots of businesses where everything in the world would have said don't continue, but they did. But that wasn't the kind of founder that we took ourselves to be. And we just couldn't see it working the way that we wanted to. So I think our own skepticism around our business has been really, really helpful, and it's allowed us to solve a lot of problems. I guess the other component to all of that is like being okay with the fact that, you might have to start from square one again. And that's really hard. I mean, I feel awful for all the people whose businesses got totally screwed from COVID, especially because like that was totally outside of their control. Like, I know a bunch of founders that had great businesses, and just from an act of God, so to speak, you're just done. And that's horrible. It really is awful. And we got lucky that that didn't happen to us. And our business was set up in a way that could actually take advantage of this kind of more digital focused situation. So I think, yeah, it's being a skeptic of yourself, and ultimately just being along for that ride. Like, I look at the 2.5 years that we spent on the first version of our business, and I could sit here and say, well, that sucked. I worked my ass off and that came to nothing. I was making no money, like all the things that you would imagine. But as I look back on it now, if this business is as successful as I'm confident it can be, and as it's looking like it might be, that was all part of the journey.
It also sounds like, though, that you guys went back and really talked to your ideal client. Like, you really went back and talked to the accounting professional, because you'd built this thing that was maybe it was a bigger impact in terms of somebody's job, somebody's career, and kind of found the wine. Like, hey, CBD is not as big of an impact, but it's just annoying as hell. I hate it. Right? You found the part that's just this squeaky, like everybody hates it. Everybody can come in on that. Like, talk a little bit about how you guys did that, because you obviously had to go back to the drawing board at some point and figure out, okay, what are we going to pivot this to?
Yeah, so it's a really important point. I would say it's the one thing that Adam and I are, if I could use this word, fundamentalists about. Like, we are absolutely radical about talking to lots and lots of our customers all the time. Before we launched the first version of our product, within like a 3-month span, Adam and I had one-on-one conversations with over 500 CPAs. And 500 doesn't feel like a big number, but when you're talking about having like a half hour conversation and like finding 500 different people that are willing to talk to you, that was like a huge mammoth task. And it was worth every minute of it. And we continue to do that every day. I'm now training members of my team to go and do that kind of thing. There's nothing like, quantitative data is really valuable. I don't want to discredit it by any means, but qualitative is so much more important at the earlier stages, because you can like, people buy things or use things based on how they feel about it. Emotion. We are not robots. We are human beings. And if you can't hear people's visceral responses to questions that you're asking or things that they're doing, you're never going to get that kind of insight into how you can really solve their problems. And so we've spent an inordinate amount of time with accountants, and I've gotten to know, like, I knew a lot of accountants becoming one myself, but I know way more of them now. It's been actually a really pleasant experience in general, because we met lots of great people along the way. And those people actually want to help us and have been really great champions of our business in various different ways. So it kind of has that double effect of being valuable. But there's nothing that I could say that would be more valuable for your business than just spending time with your target market. That's like, you might think you have a brilliant idea, But if you go and you tell 10 accountants in my case, and they all think it's meh, then it's meh, right? Like, it doesn't matter if my mom thinks that I'm, the best thing since sliced bread. She's a little bit biased. At the end of the day, it's what those people think about your product that really matters. And we say it internally that, like, the market is ultimately the authority on everything that we do. Any ideas are great ideas, and they're important because they go into the mix of things that you try. But until you validate it with the people that matter, they're just ideas, and there's no real value to them. Now, the way that we came up with the idea, actually, if you remember a couple of years ago, there was this craze around HQ. You remember that like quizzing,
The
that
trivia
like
game?
the trivia game? Yeah.
We all played it. That was a
For a
VC.
hot moment.
Yeah, that was a wild experience.
So we were at the Creative Destruction Lab during the phase of HQ, and we had tried, we felt like our product didn't have everything that it needed. And actually it was Ava Lau, who's at Wattpad. She was one of our mentors there. And she had really focused us on, like, okay, this idea of layering value for our same customers, right? So we've got recruitment for accountants. What else can we do that adds value to these people so that they're in our ecosystem, and we can continue to hold on to these people and add more and more value for them and really create a real community? Because that's what Wattpad has done a phenomenal job of. I mean, they just sold for like $750 million. So they've done pretty well at building that community. And it was in that phase that we went out and we tried to essentially validate a bunch of different ideas that we had that may have been valuable for accountants. And originally, our EdTech platform, LumiQ, was supposed to be just one layer in this greater kind of suite of services for accountants. What ended up happening was we hit on such a pain point for people. And when we launched, it just grew so well that we just said, well, hey, this is just a great business on its own. We should just not do all those other things and get distracted by these things that are less value add and focus there. And so the original idea was to create like an HQ of accounting trivia and learning that people would do and get their required hours for. And then going through whatever the 300 or 400 conversations that we had at that time, because this was, our next iteration of our business. So we went back and did the same thing. I don't think we quite got to 500 this time. But through those conversations, we figured out all of the reasons that HQ would not be a good model to base it on, which, now looking back on it 2 years ago, it's like, who remembers HQ? But people do love podcasts. As anybody listening to this can probably attest. And so that was where that idea came from. It was like, hey, this medium's awesome. It's convenient. It's mobile. It's a great way for people to learn while they're doing something else. Why don't we do podcasts? And that's how LumiQ was born.
That's what I think is such valuable advice, right? Like, it's got to be annoying if you spent so much time building up this product that no longer has a fit. And the idea of having to go back to that stage, right, and speak to 500 people again to figure out how can I pivot and iterate on this and add another layer of value or up the shopping cart if we're talking e-com, right? But I think it's really where people have to go.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Okay, let's get into a little bit of, so you guys obviously don't have to do much work on the product. Seems like it's a strong fit at this point, high retention rates, it's growing. I wanted to talk a little bit about what you said about being an entrepreneur and illuminating on some of the kind of the facades about that and people just saying like, oh, it's all great. I usually ask questions about, what's been the hardest part about being an entrepreneur that most people probably wouldn't expect and what's been the most rewarding. Generally, the kinds of answers that we get usually are talking about the wild swings. So being an entrepreneur is like really rewarding and then really devastating depending on what stage you're in and what's happened recently. But yeah, I would love to hear what your experience has been like and how you would advise people who are thinking about taking the leap.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with what you've heard from other people on that. It doesn't even happen in long time frames, like sometimes within a day. Like, you'll have one meeting and just be in the dumps, and then the next moment something will happen, you'll be like, this is amazing, the business is going so well. And then a minute later some other thing will happen and you'll be like, oh my God, this is horrible, the whole thing's falling apart. And so, yeah, I totally agree with that. I think one of the things that is very hard to overcome, at least from my perspective, especially as we were building businesses that didn't have, the same, if I could use this term, kind of like sexiness that other businesses have. When you're like, when we were at part of the creative destruction lab, I remember one time we were going up in front of like the whole room of entrepreneurs that, try to tear your business apart. And the people in front of us, they're like, we're trying to build like a teleporter, like in Star Trek, where you can like literally like teleport items from one place to another. And I'm like, that sounds amazing. And then I go up, I'm like, yeah, we're building a recruitment platform for accountants. And you just feel like, the hell am I doing, following up this act. The next one after us was like somebody trying to like take rocks from the moon, like literally sending like ship, like SpaceX up to the moon to like, I don't know, mine or harvest rocks or something. And so that's my own personal experience having reasonably unsexy businesses in our kind of path here. Now we've gotten, I think, a little bit cooler when it comes to ed tech. And again, like I'm air quoting there, but ed tech is cool now, but still like, nobody thinks accountants are cool, which is not true, by the way. Actually, one of our taglines is make CPAs cool again, because CPAs are actually really cool. We're not all number crunchers. And like half of the people are just like, okay, this guy's totally out to lunch right now. And I'm not going to listen to anything he says anymore, but it is true. I'm sure you have friends that are accountants and they're lovely people and very cool. So, there's an aspect of that. I mean, I think the cliche of like everybody thinking that you're out of your mind and that what you're doing doesn't make any sense is the case. One of the worst things ever, if you're talking to an entrepreneur, is to tell them what they should be doing, because 9 times out of 10, you don't know what you're talking about. And the entrepreneur has probably thought of those things before. And it's a very like kind of uncomfortable thing for somebody, when you're spending your entire life thinking about this problem, then for somebody to just be like, oh, I know the answer. Like you're working hundreds of hours a week on this stuff for years at a time. But, if only you knew this one thing that I knew, it would all be solved. So like, okay, like that's not true. And that's why actually we were talking before our podcast about this. I think the best advisors that I've ever had are people that start with a lot of questions and they understand your business in a way that is great. And we had a lot of those people at Creative Destruction Lab, people like Mike Serbinis or Andreas Schroeder or Ava Lau. I mean, we've had a lot of really great advisors that sit there and they want to understand your business because they understand that you know your business best, and they might be able to offer a great perspective on it, which those people especially absolutely have done and continue to do. So that's a really hard part of it, is when people think you're nuts, or when people think that like the solution is really easy and you're just not seeing it. It's like, no, like this stuff is really, really hard. And I think the one thing that I've learned about entrepreneurs doing this myself is that regardless of whether you succeed or fail, if you get to a point where you got a business that's kind of working, like that says a lot about you. It's hard to do what that is. And I mean, I would attest to a lot of luck in my case of having achieved some of these things. And, we've still got a long way to go. So I'm, by no means, putting myself up against Mark Zuckerberg or anything else out there. But when you see entrepreneurs who have failed, I think that there's a really common kind of response to be like, oh, they didn't have it or whatever. And I think there's so much that comes down to, like, I'm going to answer this more succinctly. There is so much that it takes for this to be successful. And a lot of that is luck. And so even when people fail, oftentimes they're great entrepreneurs and they're amazing at what they do. And I think that's what actually makes it even more difficult, is you can do everything right and still fail. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've given you a lot there, and maybe I should reword it all. If you want to ask the question again, go ahead. But there's a lot to be said on that topic.
Well, it's hard, right? And you said before that being a founder it's a lifestyle choice. It's not just a job. Your whole life is tied up in this, how people look at you, and your parents call you and ask you, how's that thing you're doing? Like, when are you going to go back to being a lawyer?
A real job.
Yeah. When are you going to go back to that? Right. So it's like, what's been the darkest part for you, or what's the story that's been the toughest, and how it's easy to say, right? But how do you insulate yourself from the business isn't doing well, I'm not doing well, right? Like, how do you personally do that? Like, some have to meditate for an hour a day. Other
I
people
do
have,
meditate,
yeah. So
and
I'd
I
love to
find
hear
it
that.
very useful. And the person that I was when I got into the startup world would have laughed at myself for saying that I meditate now, but I actually think it's an incredible practice that adds a lot of value. So definitely meditate. But I think the biggest challenge there is that your own self-worth gets so caught up in the success of your business, and you stop viewing yourself as separate from your business, which can get you into trouble in a lot of ways. Emotionally and psychologically, you get wrapped up into it, and each day, as we were talking about before, every up and down you take to mean like it's not only a reflection on how things are going in your business, it's a reflection of like whether you're a worthwhile human being or not. And that really, really hits hard. But it can also be really bad to get that intertwined with your business from even your business's perspective, because you start looking at you as your business, and you forget that like there are investors and there are other employees and there's all these other pieces that go into it that you need to manage separately as well. So it can actually be bad from that standpoint as well.
And so do you have any regular, like, weekly things that you need to do that? Or is it just kind of this realization overall over time, that because it probably takes some time to be able to separate yourself out and recognize, hey, I'm doing this again. Like, I'm obsessing again, that this is all me and there's nobody else on the team, and all that other stuff.
I have not solved that problem, if I'm being completely honest. Like, I still get too wrapped up in the business. What happens day to day affects my outlook. That's why meditation is so valuable. It helps me at least kind of reestablish my connection with, just the nice things of living and being, which are really hard to kind of see when so much of what you're doing is wrapped into this one thing. Certainly, things that I've heard work that I don't do successfully are like eating well and exercising. So, I can't sit here and say, here's how you solve it. Follow me, young entrepreneurs, because I'm still in the unsuccessful phase of balancing things appropriately with my life. And I don't know, when I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, I think a lot more of us are like that than you'd think. And I'm still not sold on whether you can be an entrepreneur and have balance, if that's possible, or if it just isn't really possible. I'd like to think that it is. And there are people out there that say that they have achieved that. And maybe it's just the skeptic in me, but I'm not sure if they're being completely honest with me. And if they have, that's great. I want to like learn how to do that. But I haven't done it. The best thing that I have is my co-founder. Honestly, like, you know, we were and are best friends. And that's great. And I don't think that's the only way to do it. But, when he's down, I'm the balance. And when I'm down, he's the balance. It's really bad when we're both down. And we can talk about that. You asked what the worst moment was. I'll get to that in a second. But I have a lot of respect for people that are solo entrepreneurs. I don't know how they do it, frankly, because having this one person that's been on the entire journey, every piece of it from day one with me. I mean, obviously, like I talk to my wife all the time about this stuff, but it's not the same. She's not in there every day dealing with, the same challenges that we are. And I talk to my other friends about it, but nobody is there other than him ultimately. Even, look, the other members of our management team are phenomenal people that have helped us in a million different ways. But I mean, most of them came on once we had a better business. That first couple of years which were much harder. Frankly, those are the hardest years, are when you have nothing. They weren't there for, right? But yeah, there's nothing like that person. And so if I could recommend anything, it's like find a co-founder, somebody that you can really, that you got to really be able to handle stuff with that person, be really honest with them and know that they've got your back and that you have their back. Because I lived through a situation where co-founders didn't have that at the previous company that I was at. And that company never had a chance for success because of that. There were other problems with the company, like I mentioned, the commercialization issue around the technology. Fine, anything could potentially have been overcome, but like the two co-founders of that company did not get along, did not see eye to eye, and as time wore on, they got farther and farther apart from each other about how they saw this business going. And that meant no matter what, even if they had had a great business, it wouldn't have been successful. And so the lowest moment was that moment when we realized that first business that we tried for 4 months wasn't going to work. I mean, that was the moment where Adam and I looked at each other and be like, okay, like, are we going back to our jobs? Is that what we're doing? And there's a really funny moment where we were going to do some validation work on what became Luminari with a CEO of this business that actually a bunch of people from the last business that I was a part of moved to his business. And so he was kind of helping us validate our new business model. And in front of my co-founder, he says, you know, Michael, this business is stupid. You shouldn't do that. Why don't you just come work for me? You can come and be my CFO, and I'm going to offer you X amount of dollars, which frankly was 3 times as much money as I had ever made in my life. And you should just come and do that, like in front of my co-founder. And that was a very difficult moment. I mean, for us, because it was like, that was around the time that we really started to feel like this business wasn't going to go anywhere. But on top of that, I'm sitting here and I'm saying, like, am I stupid? Like, I'm going to turn down this paycheck at this cool, like, it was a cool company. And there were a lot of people that I loved working there because they all came from my last company. And I was like, am I just stupid right now? Like, we don't have anything. And, you know, periodically you still feel like that. Am I stupid? Or maybe more than periodically, but frequently is probably the better word. But that was the hardest moment. That was the valley of sorrows for us, was, you know, shit, this thing doesn't work. And now we have to start from square one again. And that was really hard.
And thank you for like being so candid about that, because I've talked to other founders too, and you do have to maintain this public facade of everything's totally fine, but they'll say it wasn't until we went to a dinner with a bunch of other tech CEOs late at night after like a couple bottles of wine that, you know, they said, I haven't actually slept in a few weeks, and I was crying in the shower last night, and all that other stuff that we like. People are going through the same thing, and we all know that it's happening, but especially now, right? Because what you're talking about, so many other people are asking themselves, this is just the wrong time. There's an act of God that came in and wiped us out. Like, I really should just take the job now. Like, and maybe, and in some cases that might be the right decision, but people are going through it. And so I just so appreciate you being honest about that. I mean, how would you answer that to somebody who maybe things haven't worked out so far? I mean, other than just looking at the raw numbers and saying, okay, this isn't feasible anymore, and you need to have a shelter. But yeah, like somebody that's going through that right now, like, how should they think of that decision? How did you kind of look at that when you got offered that job and things weren't going well? Like, was there a process there where you drew out like a decision tree, or did you just kind of go with your gut?
I'd like to say that there was, and if I'm being honest, there wasn't for us at that moment. I mean, we were only 4 months into the journey at that point, and I think for me at that moment, it was like I didn't feel like I had given it a full try yet. That if I looked back on it, I would have regretted giving up so soon. I think that doesn't apply when it comes to a business idea. It should actually be the opposite, that you give up sooner than you think you should, because if it probably isn't working, it isn't working. Right. And it took us having a business, our current business, that really works for us to realize what that actually looks like and feels like, and to realize, oh, like all of those businesses that we really wanted to work weren't working at all. But the question around, should you continue to try when you're right at the beginning or not? I mean, it's just something that I guess you got to be able to look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and say, like, I gave this a good shot. And if you built something as much as you could and it didn't work out, and now you're staring at an empty bank account and realizing that you probably do need sustenance to survive. There's no shame in that. And I think that's one of the things that's really crummy about the current ecosystem, is that we idolize this small group of people, not even successful entrepreneurs, the 1%, like successful entrepreneurs are 1% of the whole group. And then we idolize the 1% of that group that built these massive, world changing businesses. I mean, for anybody that's a fan of the Silicon Valley TV show, every time Hulu says, oh, we're going to change the world, it's like, well, not every business is going to change the world and feed the hungry, but that doesn't mean it's not a good business and something that's really meaningful and worthwhile for you to do with your time and life, and that it can't be fulfilling. And so I think it really, and this is kind of a cop-out answer, but it really just comes down to how you feel about it and being honest with yourself. And I think that's one thing that I look back on Adam and I doing right most of the time, certainly not all of the time, was that we were honest with ourselves about the business, that, oh, this isn't working. And we'd really like it to. I mean, don't get me wrong, we fell into traps of trying to fool ourselves into thinking that something was working when it wasn't. But I think that if anything, we were successful at saying this isn't working and moving on to the next thing. The decision of whether to move on or to give up is a much harder one.
You brought up something about the ecosystem that I think is really poignant. And I guess we'll end off on this question, which is, if you were to change one thing about the current ecosystem now, what would it be?
I think ideology, if that's the right way to do it. There is a religion in the startup ecosystem, a dogma, if you will, that pervades everything. Even the way that we use the word lifestyle business is so pejorative. It's like insulting, right? You go to talk to an advisor, oh, this is just a lifestyle business. It's like, hold on a second. Like, lifestyle businesses are great businesses to begin with. And, a lot of the wealthiest people out there are people that have just built great, what tech founders or the startup community would call lifestyle businesses. And, probably Starbucks was seen as a lifestyle business, to some people. Oh, you're just going to open up a coffee shop? Who does that? It's like, well, now look at it. So I think that there's this pervasive ideology that does a couple of things. It forces people to not value things that really are, in the case of businesses that don't look and feel like a Facebook. It skews financing, right, to these like two extremes of either you get VC financing and you have to be a unicorn and grow the top line without any consideration for profit and all of the things that come with that form of financing, which again is really great for a certain type of business, but certainly not for many or even most businesses. So it kind of has that effect of perverting that system that we fell into. Like, we are not, it's not like I had some prescient understanding of this before I got into it. We went and we wanted to do exactly that, go and raise VC funding. And now I look at it and I go, well, maybe we'll raise VC funding if that's the right funding. And so where that changes the ecosystem is there needs to be more funding that is in between, like bank debt for like traditional cash flow businesses and VC funding. There's got to be something in the middle for companies that want to grow fast, but may not be $1 billion company, but maybe a very, very great, $50 million company or whatever it might be. And it also, I think, affects how people view themselves in this, right? This is like kind of the mental health or psychological component of it, where it's like, I know people who have built great businesses that consider themselves a failure because it wasn't a unicorn. And I know people who, this is where it gets the worst, where you take a great business and you screw it up to try to become the Facebook when it never was a Facebook. It was just a really great business and it just should have been there. And so, Adam and I have really tried to not fall into that trap, to varying degrees of success at different points in our journey. But that's the one thing that I would change, is this idea that there's this like one type of success in the industry. And it really isn't. And I think I'm hopeful that stories like WeWork have actually made that more obvious to more people, that like just focusing on top line, raising a ton of money, grow with no sense of, whether you can actually make this work from a profit perspective. That's not the only way to run a business. And a lot of businesses shouldn't be run that way. And again, not to say that every business shouldn't be run that way, but every business also shouldn't have to be run that way.
I love it. There's so many other things to ask you, but we've got to end off here. Like, I'd love to have you on again. Thanks so much for coming on.
100%.
It's been a pleasure.
Happy to, happy to. And if anybody is an accountant listening, then they can check us out at lumiqlearn.com, LUMIQLEARN.com. That's my shameless plug, because if you're an entrepreneur, you got to have a shameless plug everywhere you go, whatever you do. So yeah, check us out there if you are interested. And thanks for listening.
And we'll definitely be adding Mike to the show notes. So anybody that wants to look can check us out there too.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.